Our next speaker is Claude Alvarez. Please.
Assalamu alaikum. And with such distinguished speakers, one gets very nervous. I have done 25-30 page paper which is being translated into Farsi, so please read that when you have the time and when you have nothing else to do. But one of the things that we need to recognize is how we see a lot of resistance to political imperialism. It's also been mentioned by Munir. We have a lot of resistance. If somebody tries to do something in Vietnam or in Afghanistan or Iraq, there is resistance. It's not that people are dead. There are people fighting against it. But for some reason, there is no resistance to the imperialism of knowledge. This is something that we should try and recognize. And why does this happen? And why is it that our universities today are all part of that imperialism of knowledge, that whole empire of knowledge that has been constructed over the last 100, 150 years? How is it that our universities have become part of that imperialism of knowledge? How is that we don't resist it at all? We resist political domination, but we welcome intellectual domination. We concede to intellectual domination. And we are willing to accept anything provided it comes from a European or from an American, as you were saying, the validation procedure, but we are hesitant about trying to validate it ourselves. Because in some sense, we consider ourselves deficient. Now, where does this idea of deficiency come? That we lack something. Where do we think, for example, that children lack something? So therefore, we have got to educate them for 14 years. They are like empty pots, and we've got to keep filling those pots with something. Where do we get the idea that nature is deficient? You know, it's a very fundamental assumption that we have, that nature is deficient. And the things that we do are superior to what nature does. It all comes back to this idea of deficiency. Some people have everything, some people don't. And the people who have everything have got this imperial duty to ensure the perfection of other human beings. They are perfect in themselves. They are superior human beings. They have a superior system of knowledge. Europe is basically the superior culture. We are all inferior cultures. We are defeated cultures in a certain sense, because we have not created what Europe has created. Now, if you look at the history of human beings in the last 150 years, you find this as a very strong tendency in imperial culture and in imperial practice. They see societies which are not European as they see a field. You want to cultivate a field in which something is growing which you consider wild, which is not domesticated, something wild. What do? You first eradicate everything in the field. And then you manure it, and immediately you plant your own seed. Because if you don't plant your seed immediately, then the wilderness will take over again. And in one of the very powerful statements made by an Englishman when he was trying to, during the conquest of Ireland, this was the imagery that he used, that if we do not subject the Irish to a war and clean them out completely and then plant immediately our own culture and our own seed, the Irish will revert to barbarism. Because in contradistinction to the English, the Irish were considered as barbarian. Later on, they began to consider everybody as barbarians. Indians were also considered as very primitive and savage after 1800. And in 1813, William Wilberforce actually made a very interesting speech in Parliament where he said that these Hindus are so depraved that unless we convert them all to Christianity, there is no redemption for them. Of course, that big project failed entirely, and we are still very comfortably Hindus. And that big, conquest of Hindustan and making it into another version of Christendom completely fell on its face. But 20 years later, the person whom Raju mentioned, Macaulay, he proved to be more successful. And this is again what Munir says, that we are defenseless when it comes to education. And here is this Englishman called Macaulay who comes and says that all the literature of Arabia and all the literature of Asia is not worth a single shelf of European literature. And it can all be put into the basket. And we should stop teaching people in India in Persian and in Urdu and in Sanskrit and in Arabic. These were languages which were taught in India in 1800. We Indians were teaching in Persian. It's so difficult for us to accept that we were teaching people in Persian, we were teaching them in Arabic, and we were teaching them in Sanskrit. And he said, nothing good can come by teaching people in these very crude languages. The only language worth teaching them is English. And the only knowledge worth giving them is the knowledge of European literature. Everything else is to be cast aside, is to be thrown aside. And that's how we come to this conclusion eventually after being been through this education system of several decades. It's now not just 10 decades or 10 years or 20 years, it's several decades. We come to the conclusion somehow that everything about us is really useless. We come to the conclusion that our crops are useless, our houses are useless, our language is useless, our agriculture is useless, our crops, our music, our administration, everything is useless. So if everything is useless, then we are really useless people. And then you have this whole educational edifice built on this idea that we are useless. And that nothing in us that we bring out is of any value. It has already been considered, it has already been cast aside. And you have this whole edifice of higher education, lower education, wholesale imported from outside, and which we continue with such dedication to multiply and expand. And it's all based on something which we have not created ourselves. It's all what we call derivative knowledge, second-hand knowledge, knowledge which we don't even have sometimes primary experience. It is experience that we have got from books, textbooks, and so on. And it's amazing that we should try and understand how we have reached today a situation where entire peoples like us consider that all that was best in our civilization should be kept at a distance. And everything that is valuable, we should take from people who are very far away, who come even speaking a different language. And we should learn it also in a foreign language. This is the situation in which we find ourselves and in which we are having today this conference. And if we don't accept these assumptions, that this is the way we are doing things, then there is no hope for us. Forget about 175 years where we are behind them in every way, in whatever they are doing. Sometimes it's good that we are 175 years behind them in our ability to destroy. It's good sometimes. It's not a bad thing. But if you want to continue in this trend of doing this fruitless activity, there is a lot of outside appearance that is very deceptive. The buildings, the coursework, the number of students, all these people who come together and produce what? I ask myself so many times, I come from India, what has a sociologist in India produced in the last 50 years? Is there any book that a sociologist has produced in India which is taught, for example, in the US or in Europe as a standard text? Anything in political science? Anything in philosophy? No, they don't consider Indian philosophy as philosophy. The most amazing thing is that in Delhi University, where Professor Lal is going to teach now, West philosophy that is taught, 80% or 80% of the marks is given to Western philosophy, and 20 marks are given to Indian philosophy. This is in Delhi University, which is the capital of India. Now, India is the storehouse of all the philosophies of the world, including Buddhism, including yoga, Patanjali Sutra, everything comes from India. And today, in the main principal university in the country, 80% marks are given to somebody who studies Western philosophy. Now, this is a scandal. And if I were the Minister of Education, I would have sent all these professors out to do something more worthy with their lives, rather than to continue this farce and this circus of what is called higher education. At some stage, one has to make a break. And one has to say, at this stage we stop and we don't go further. We say no, we have a resistance, and we say that we can't continue with this, and we will not continue with this. Now, if you reach that stage, and if you come to that stage, then I think we can move further. And I would suggest that we can get a lot of critiques of Eurocentrism, and we can get a lot of critiques of imperialism and academic imperialism. And we have got a lot of very good people to write about it. But when it comes to getting out and moving in a different direction, which will help our science and our education and our youngsters, that job cannot be done by Europeans and by Americans. That has to be done by us. It cannot be done under their tutelage and by being educated by them. It has to be done by us, by educating ourselves and by bringing out what we have within ourselves. And if we spend the next 2 days doing this, then I'm quite sure that something great will come out of this conference. Thank you.